Hello, I'm Nicholas Kitchen. I'm first violinist of the Borromeo String Quartet and also artistic director of the Heifetz International Music Institute. And I'm so honored to be speaking with you today about something that's been a wonderful discovery within the work of our string quartet. I'm going to share with you some general things that we've actually discovered in all of Beethoven's manuscripts, but we'll make them relevant to the performance that you will hear associated with this talk of Opus 130 with the last movement of Opus 133, the Grosse Fugue, which is of course the original way that Beethoven conceived of this string quartet in B-flat. I'm speaking to you from the President's Library of the New England Conservatory of Music, and this is a room where our string quartet actually got coachings with people such as Larry Lesser, who was president at the time we were studying at this school. And then when we graduated, we were very honored and continue to be honored to join this institution's faculty as string quartet in residence. It is also a very special feeling to share this information in the context of the concerts and the study which happens at the Library of Congress. Not only have we loved being part of that concert series before there was any tangible relationship, it happens that the violin that I'm holding right now is in fact a violin owned by the Library of Congress. It's the violin of my former teacher, Szymon Goldberg. And a fair time after he passed away, and I studied with him for 5 years at the Curtis Institute of Music, his widow, Miyoko Yamane Goldberg, made a decision to give the library this violin, because in fact it's a twin of the Chrysler Guarneri del Gesù, and for it to be done with the intention that I should perform on it while I am performing. And someday we will pass that along to another performer that we hope will celebrate what Mr. Goldberg showed us was possible as a wonderful artist and absolutely beautiful musician. Well, it also happens that the Library of Congress, in its role of preserving the treasures of music history, has a manuscript of one of the movements of this string quartet, the second movement of the string quartet, Opus 130. And they were kind enough to share that with me quite a while ago, and they are kind enough to share many of these treasures on their website in a way that people can easily study them. So I encourage you to study this very manuscript through their very wonderful setup for you to be able to see it. Well, the reason that became relevant was about 13 years ago, our string quartet, the Borromeo Quartet, became known as the first string quartet to use computers as a way of reading music. And we did this with the help of foot pedals. I'm holding up one right now. That is my current pedal. Those pedals allow us to turn the pages on the computer, and this means that we can read off a PDF file. The reason this was relevant, and actually with a profound connection to some of the things that Mr. Goldberg taught me and so many other people, is that it means that it is really natural to use a complete score. And that is exactly why we started using computers. So that in fact within the quartet, all four members, or it could be a larger group too, they don't just see their individual part, which is the long tradition of just seeing what you play. In fact, everyone is seeing what everyone else plays. And we have found that this transforms the nature of our work as a string quartet. And we really see every detail of the way our parts interact and understand whole new layers of how the composer might have imagined those parts coming together. Well, that is something that was mostly connected to printed scores. But I think the wonderful surprise was that those same PDF files can be of source material. It could be a copyist version, or it could be an early edition. But even more importantly, and especially in the case of Beethoven, it could be a manuscript. I know somewhere around there, maybe 12 years ago, I thought, well, why don't I just try playing off of a Beethoven manuscript when we're rehearsing? And so at that time, on IMSLP, which is a wonderful site for all kinds of musical resources, they have the file of Opus 59, number 3. And so I downloaded that and I started reading off of it. And actually, it's hard to tell because I kind of know the piece from memory, that is the truth. But I didn't have any trouble reading what was in front of me. Moreover, it became immediately evident that looking at those pages created discovery after discovery. At that moment, mainly in the form of the chance to see what Beethoven had crossed out. You would see sections where he wrote every note very securely and really didn't seem to have much question. But then you encounter sections where almost everything has been crossed out and replaced with something else. And sometimes this might just be a dynamic sequence that he would change. Sometimes it was whole pitch groupings. It really could be anything. But I think you can imagine that the moment you're seeing in front of you the history of that decision making, it brings you a very special insight or a feeling that starts to create insight into some of the things that Beethoven must have had on his mind as he was trying to pick the best way for this piece to come fully into its detailed form. So that was exciting right away, and frankly, I started to make use of manuscripts as much as I could. And at that point, I couldn't get that many of the string quartets, but I could find a few, and I started to do that. Well, every time, I say this to students, you will find something the first time you look at a manuscript. You will find something interesting, even if it's something that was not different than your printed part, but you see the decision making that was behind it. But I also say that every single time you look at it, you're probably going to notice 10 or 20 new things. And I have certainly found that. And as I got to spend more time with these manuscripts, particularly of Beethoven, I started to just notice that there were things on the manuscript that were actually divergent from what we see in print. And the first thing that I kind of noticed was that there were dynamics which were really written down differently than what we see in print. I would like to jump to a diagram because I think it's just as well to explain this right away, though it is kind of interesting how, at least for me, I became aware of it in stages. At first you kind of don't see these things, and then you start to see them very clearly. But let me explain this system. You're going to see a little diagram that I've made here. And if you start in the middle of that, there are kind of two staircases that you see. And if you start at the top of the first staircase, you'll see some of the medium dynamics like mezzo piano, so half piano, something in the middle. And then beneath that you see piano, which is a very normal, soft dynamic. And this is what we see in print. We see P just in that way. And but then you see something that we do not see in print, which is a P with a line on the stem. And right next to it you see a P with two lines on the stem. And now it's pretty evident, I think, to most everyone that when you had one P and then you go to two Ps, that's gotten softer. But I think you see again that in a very systematic way, what one encounters in Beethoven's manuscript is not just two Ps, but two Ps with one line on the stem and two Ps with two lines on the stem. And then we encounter something that I'll come back to in a moment, but you see how it says PPMO. And just imagine the word pianissimo, and then take those last two letters, MO, and sort of scoot them over in front of the two Ps. But we'll come back to that. And indeed, on this staircase, you see three Ps, which is really getting very soft, and indeed, three Ps with one line and three Ps with two lines. I will tell you that you see these very markings thousands of times in Beethoven's manuscripts. Now, that might just be an accident and something that was kind of almost a doodling or sort of random variation. That's certainly one way to look at those things. But I will tell you, and I'll continue to talk about the forte in a moment, that what I have found and what we've found as a group rehearsing from these manuscripts is that these special marks do not seem to be put in random places. In fact, they are put in choice places, which have become extremely inspiring to us as players for what they seem to ask us to do. By the way, what is communicated to us, or what we've kind of deduced over time, is that that line seems to refer to an emotional intensity. So one line is some of that emotional intensity, and two lines is a lot of that emotional intensity. So it's a little bit like an actor might be speaking in a certain kind of soft voice, and then they might transfer to a voice that has more excitement or more different mood, and then it might become even more intense, so there's something really special about how they feel. That's the world that we feel is kind of asked for by these dynamics. And I'll just give as an aside, you might remember that there's a great magic when the Ninth Symphony opens. You hear these sort of vibrating, tremolo-like things in the strings, and these ta-dum, ba-ba. Well, that dynamic is two Ps with two lines. That is the first dynamic of the Ninth Symphony. And it, of course, is absolutely appropriate to that incredible electric excitement of that moment. Well, let's continue and look at the forte dynamics, and then we can put it all in context. And eventually I want to put this into the context of the piece that you are going to hear us play for you, which is Opus 130 and the Grosse Fugue. In the forte direction, you also see something like mezzo forte, half forte, poco forte, and then a regular forte, which is a very, very normal dynamic that we see in print all the time, indicating strong. And then is where Beethoven seems to need more layers of communication about how certain fortes fit into the flow of the piece. So what we've noticed is that he uses different numbers of letters of the word forte in order to give some sense of architecture and hierarchy about how that loud moment in the music fits into the total picture. So when it's a little more excited and a little more important, it's FO. If it is even more excited and even more important, it's FOR. If it's really, really a big moment, it's FORTE. And then, of course, you see the FF, which is our sort of normal, very loud dynamic. But then, as a kind of polar opposite to the PPMO that we looked at a moment ago, you see FFMO, which is the same thing, fortissimo, and then the last two letters brought over in front of FF. When he puts FFMO or PPMO, it does seem that it also has this incredible kind of excitement, this extra emotional impact. But it also seems to indicate that it is just a really important spot in the unfolding of the music. And then he provides something where he doesn't seem to have too much interest in going beyond what it says, obviously, which is 3 Fs, or triple forte. And that's just really, really loud. Well, many editions have made clear that they are choosing to eliminate these distinctions. One can read it in prefaces and this sort of thing. And it's a logical approach, but I will tell you, and hope to connect it to the music you're going to hear, that that is just not what we've found. We've found that these slight distinctions in the way Beethoven marks these items in the musical sequence do seem to ask us for wonderful, wonderful, slight modulations, as it were, of the levels of intensity, and show us something about the structure that underlies the unfolding of the music. And, well, it seems that details are something Beethoven loves. to lavish enormous amount of thinking on. And one can find a lot of letters where he gets upset about people not noticing the difference between dots, which really look like a round little dot, and strokes. I call them line staccatos because Beethoven really does do a line. And that line sometimes gets to be as long as the stem of the note. And if you look again at this diagram, I'm laying out what we have found to be shown very imaginatively in the manuscripts, which is that Beethoven seems to be giving us 4 different levels of staccato. He gives us the dot, which is delicate and just a very short and light kind of sting of the note. And then there's a small line staccato, which I think adds a little bit more intensity to that bite. And then a medium line staccato, which is definitely a higher level of intensity to the bite of the note. And then a long line staccato, which really has the highest level of intensity in that bite of the note. Now, I say that about the bite of the note because I think there are a lot of variety of the exact lengths that may result with any of these marks. And Beethoven does seem to enjoy putting different levels on different parts, and I don't think that means the parts play different lengths, but I do think he's showing us some of his imagination about the voicing of which part can sound in what way. And this is very much the way a pianist might feature the bass in a certain kind of thing, or feature the tenor, or feature the soprano, so that we get a different voicing or a different total effect to the combined sonority. And then there is one more category, which is what we are noticing in the manuscripts, which has not been preserved in our printed editions. And by the way, let me just say and repeat that there are things which change after the manuscript. So it is not a good idea to consider the manuscript as the absolute last word, though occasionally it really is almost the last word on what the composer, Beethoven, has to say about that piece. And it's certainly almost always near the last word, but there are changes. So I think as people look into these manuscripts, and my encouragement to you is in this world that we're in now, where it's not that hard for us to find these resources, I would encourage you to take the pieces of Beethoven that you love and look at the manuscripts. I think you will find it very rewarding, even if you don't read music, to see the sort of shapes of that music you're hearing and see it's quite evident the way that he worked on those details that give it its expression. And you will see these marks that we're talking about, and I think you can draw your own conclusion about what you think they might mean or what he's trying to say with them. I will also add that Beethoven is a person who really valued efficiency. When he would encounter a spot in the music where it was a repeat of something that came before, he seems to just go to great lengths to not write it again. So he will map out the bars, he'll write a little cue that kind of shows you what it's referring to, and then make a squiggle and say, as before. So, given those things, I think it's a little hard to imagine that he would put all kinds of extra marks if they didn't have any significance or meaning or value to him. Well, the one other item which is not preserved in the print that we are used to now, though it was preserved in many early editions, is what we call hairpins or expressive swell pairs. And when Beethoven wrote an expressive swell pair, and that's a swell up and a swell down, most of the time he would choose to make them into a diamond. So he would close the two pairs together so it forms a diamond shape. For the most part, that is the type that he would write, and he writes it very clearly, and sometimes he even reinforces the connections where they join. But then there are certain special moments when he writes them separate. And just to get right away to what at least we found to be the meaning that goes along with that, is that when he connects them, this signifies a surge of expressive energy. Now that usually results in it getting louder and softer, but I think the driving force is expression, which also means sometimes Beethoven, as well as Brahms, by the way, will mark this on a single note in the piano. And though most people will read that as crescendo diminuendo, obviously once a hammer has struck on the piano, and both of them were very good pianists, there is nothing that is going to make it crescendo and diminuendo. However, if one views it as an emotional instruction, it is not so strange at all to put it in those spots in the music. Well, whatever its exact meaning, this is the way Beethoven mostly does this mark. And then, when he separates them, which is quite rare, he seems to be saying that there's a swell up in expression and then a separate swell down as a separate event. And that when they're joined together, it's a single event that goes up and down. Well, those are the three categories that we've noticed in the manuscripts that we realize are definitely not included in even the beautifully prepared editions that we are accustomed to with Beethoven. And in our rehearsing experience, I know myself I would not give up the chance to be consulting the manuscript, because this information, this extra information, if you will, or this further information, is wonderful. It is just so exciting to have these requests, and I might say these are requests directly from Beethoven, to give a special energy to a certain note and a special quality to the pianissimo and a special kind of arrival in the whole architecture of the music. Now, just to give you a sense of the scope of where these markings are used, because I will tell you I noticed them at first, and I was very open, or I really wanted to establish in my own mind, am I just seeing an experiment of that moment, of that month, of that time, that he just tried marking a few things, or even marked it kind of by accident and not really intentionally? That is very, very possible. But I will say that in order to evaluate whether that's true or not, I've tried to look at really as many manuscripts of Beethoven as I can. And what I found is that the marks that I've just explained to you are used consistently in basically every major work between 1802 and 1827. Prior to that point, a lot of manuscripts are lost, and he doesn't seem to have really settled on the system that I'm describing to you now. What's for sure is almost every manuscript you find after Opus 30 basically has these marks. There seem to be just a couple where he used them less, but even there, they're often there just a few times in the score. A particular one is Opus 69, the third cello sonata, where you don't see too many of the dynamics, but the last time the theme comes, it's FFMO, exactly where that marking is appropriate to sum up the whole movement. In contrast, when we get into the area of the piece we're about to look at, Opus 130, and if we look at Opus 135, if we look at Opus 132, 133, which is part of this, 130, 131, 127, you will find these marks thousands of times. They are literally on every page. That goes also for the Ninth Symphony, the Eighth Symphony, the Seventh Symphony. The Sixth Symphony is a little less, but it's still there. The Fifth Symphony has wonderful and amazing uses of these marks, as does the Fourth Symphony. And the Third Symphony, we don't have the manuscript, but actually a beautiful copyist's version also includes all of these marks. In the string quartets, I already mentioned the late quartets, but these marks are in great and very effective use in Opus 95, in Opus 74, in Opus 59 number 3, Opus 59 number 2, and Opus 59 number 1. The manuscripts don't exist for the first six string quartet, the Opus 18, but there is a copy that Beethoven had made out for his close friend Carl Amenda of Opus 18 number 1, in fact, in a sort of draft version, or a version that he later revised and improved upon. And in that copy that he sent to Amenda, the copyist includes actually all the marks that I have just laid out for you. Also, a very interesting case is Beethoven's Fantasy Opus 77, which is one of the rare works that Beethoven wrote out the engraver's copy. So I guess he couldn't find a copyist in that case, so he wrote very neatly a copy of that work that they could work from. And in that engraver's copy, you will find all of the marks that I have just mentioned. Well, I think I didn't mention yet the Missa Solemnis, which is one of the most magnificent uses of these markings. And I will say that when you look at the Missa Solemnis, what you will see is a kind of Rosetta Stone, where the words are showing us and pointing us towards some of the possible meanings of these marks. So, at the very important moment when the Holy Spirit is incarnate in Mary to become Jesus, et incarnatus est, that moment is flooded with that special PP with 2 lines on it, calling for that special excitement. You see here one of the first of the times I noticed the mark 2 Ps with 2 lines on it, and this is of course the amazing beginning of the Waldstein Sonata, and I think you can just see how wonderful it is to be asked to give this opening such a special energy. Speaking of the piano sonatas, fantastic uses of these markings are in Opus 53, Opus 90, Opus 101, Opus 111, Opus 109, Opus 79. I don't trust my memory to say all of the opus numbers, but basically they are throughout, and of course Opus 57, the Appassionato, and they are in the bagatelles, they are in the variations, they are marvelously used in the Diabelli variations, they are fantastically used in the Emperor Concerto. We go to the violin piano sonatas and you will see these marks used steadily. Not so much in the Spring Sonata, number 5, but then after that in number 6, 7, 8, 9, we don't have a reliable manuscript, but in the copyist version you will see these marks used amply and wonderfully. And in the Sonata number 10, they are just beautifully informative to the way one plays the piece. Similarly, in the cello sonatas, I already mentioned the 3rd Sonata, but we have wonderful and complete manuscripts for the 4th and the 5th Sonata. And these expressive marks are a huge part of how those pieces unfold. Really marvelous. So I think you're getting the feeling, as I'm describing this, that these marks really are everywhere. They are in his most important works. And what's interesting is you stand back from Beethoven's life, and he's credited, and people marvel at the fact that he reinvented himself, and along with himself, sort of the possibilities of music in general, completely reinventing to become what we call middle Beethoven, and then once again to move to what we call late Beethoven. And interestingly, these marks that I'm referring to stay exactly the same through all of those transformations. They do not change form. You do not see a piano with 3 lines. You do not see an FORT. And many people have said, well, Beethoven is such a messy writer, and boy, some pages really can get messy, that's for sure. How can you imagine that those differences of staccato are not just random accidents of how the pen comes down? Well, one thing I would point to is that, first of all, one must look at them, and I think you really do have a hard time not accepting the enormous difference of size as being something intentional. But a little bit in a more detailed sense, you can look on the very same page at the way he will put the dots that make a colon after a dynamic mark, or the dot that adds half of the length to an existing note. And you will see remarkable consistency in the way those dots are put down with the pen. And if in fact these wild differences of staccato were caused just by sort of random motions of the hand, I don't think you would see that kind of consistency in the other items on the page. And in fact, you do see that kind of consistency in the other items on the page. And much more than that, even in a printed score, we can see details which are hard to comprehend how subtle they are. Beethoven will seem to really care when notes of the same value are in sequence. He really cares whether they're grouped 4 and 4, meaning the beams that hold the rhythmic values together, whether they're 4 and 4, or 2 and 4, or 2 and 2 and 4. And this is something he will even correct it to change those beams on the notes. So it is obviously something he cares about quite a bit. And yes, a lot of people have concluded that many of the details that I'm noticing must be somehow accidental. I have not found that to be the case with the way they relate to the music itself. And this is the moment that we can sort of turn our attention to that piece of music, Opus 130 and the Grosse Fugue. And I'm very happy and excited to share with you the way those instructions inspire us. So, what you're looking at on the page right now is the first movement of Opus 130. Now, besides the expressive marks, I'd like you to just notice that on the top line there are 4 complete bars, and you'll see one of these swells and then a piano, and then you'll see another swell and a piano. And what I'd like to just put in your mind is that what Beethoven's doing right from the moment he begins is he's setting up a kind of a checkerboard, or you could almost see it like a crenellated top of a castle or something. He's pointing up these alternations and these grid patterns which move from great contrast. And this will continue throughout the entire work on both a small scale and a large scale. And let me also put in there the idea that he is playing with the concept of acceleration. So the very first rhythm is di, tan, tan, ta, and it accelerates, and then we have a subito piano, and then we go slower again, di, ta, and then he does it again, di, tan, tan, ta, he goes back to piano. This is the alternation, and it's also the acceleration. Now, that is a structural item of the piece, and I think the piece makes a brilliant kind of exploration of that alternating, that sense of alternating energy, contrasting energy. But let's now look at the second line on this page, and you'll see there's a crescendo right at the end of the first line, and then some lines that show that that crescendo continues. And what do you see in the first violin part as the first arrival? Well, in fact, it is FO. So it is not just F. He's showing this is a little bit more important. This is our first stop on this grand 50-minute journey through this piece. And there is the first FO. By the way, while we're on this page, I think you can enjoy seeing, if you look at the 4th line down from the top of the score, which is the cello part, you will see that he made a slur for the cello, and I call these decision slurs. And when I make additions of these, I put a D on the slur to show that he made a decision, because I think you can very easily see that he decided, no, I need to go further. I need to include those next notes of the cello as well. This again is very exciting for us to see his decision-making process, where he is reaching for something more and rethinking it as he imagines the music. Well, this is a slow introduction. And just to reinforce the sense, I move now to the second page, and you see this very active part at the bottom of that page on the right. And you see in the second violin, dun, dun, da, da, which is again the acceleration idea. Slow, slow, faster. And we turn to the next page, we have piano. We do that quick alternation, that checkerboard. Then we go back up to the forte, acceleration with it again, and then back down to the piano again. This is going to happen a lot in this piece. Then we even have an alternation where we go back to the slow music, and then we go back to the fast music, once again with alternations of forte and piano. Well, there are so many details. I'm certainly not going to walk through each detail of this, but I do want to move along to some of the really nice architectural points. And once again, Beethoven gives us some cues with these, which are very, very welcome. So we move along in the music, and there's a very playful da-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum 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 ba, and then we go team da-da-da-da-da-dum. Very, very energetic and important arrival. Once again, look at the first violin part, and he's given us a little marker here that this energy is kind of affirming that it is a little more. It is FO. Now, we keep going. Lots of boisterous stuff happening in the music. Then we go into a singing theme, very beautiful and tranquil. And then I'd like you to look at this moment, because there are the words ben marcato, so it's supposed to have a very articulate energy. And you see that there are even the medium staccatos, and I think you see emphatically in all four parts the two P's with the two lines. So this happens to go ba-da-da-dum, 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 and it has these stops. It's sort of skittering along in a very kind of excited way. Well, I think you can relate to the fact that having that special two-line marking at that moment in the music is wonderful. It's just such a great invitation to create that special energy. And we might do it anyway. I'm pretty sure we would. But it is so exciting to sort of be guided and affirmed and encouraged by details that seem to come, well, they don't seem to come, they do come directly from Beethoven. Now, I say, people may disagree about what these marks are. They may disagree whether they have meaning. But there they are, very clearly, very emphatically, and very appropriate to what's happening in the music. Not just appropriate, but exciting. Well, we had the Ben Marcato version. I turned to the next page, and now, just as emphatically, we have all four parts with two P's with two lines, but now this is the smooth version. And so you see the first violin gliding down, and everyone is doing these long notes along with it. And now we start a dialogue, and I'd just like you to take a peek at this page, and you will see that all of these quarter notes, and then the slurs, all of those quarter notes are marked with an enormous amount of energy in the staccato. I would say these are certainly medium staccato, and I think actually really these are large staccatos. And yes, Beethoven is a tiny bit sloppy, so that you have to make some decisions there. But I think these are definitely in that category, and they are certainly not even close to the small and delicate dots that he will put elsewhere. I might say I mentioned the grammatical items. You can look at them on this page as well. The crescendo, the little dots that go along with that, and how consistently small with no width whatsoever. It's really a round dot every single time it's on this page. But the other item, which kind of points to a pretty substantial questioning of the idea that the different lengths are random, is that Beethoven loves the mark portato. And portato is where you have dots or staccatos, bites on the note, and it's combined with the slur. And there are, again, thousands of these throughout his manuscripts. And there is one moment in Opus 59-3 where he experimented with putting a longer staccato underneath the slur, and he seemed to abandon it right away. But everywhere else, so that might be the 5, and then the other 995 are absolutely beautifully formed dots over and over and over again. And once again, it seems quite unlikely that he would not be showing some carelessness if in fact the different lengths were also a result of carelessness. So you see all of these different energies in operation here, and what I do want to take you to is a moment that is right before we return to the material. We do the recapitulation. And first I want to show you this page where the first violin has a soaring melody and it's answered by a soaring melody in the cello. And you can see what special energy Beethoven asked for by these connected expressive swell pairs. And you see how decisively they are connected and also how evocative they are of what he seems to be aiming at in the music. Well, there's one more repeat of this material, and it's the repeat that is, in a sense, the pulling back of a wave before the wave arrives. So just in these moments before we crash into the recapitulation, you notice that he puts the two-line pianissimo and prepares this wonderful crescendo from the first violin and the whole group. The first violin is kind of doing the leading melodic line there, and sure enough, we turn the corner and we have landed energetically in the recapitulation. Now, again, many details to look at that are of so much interest, but I thought I would show you that the very same moment that was FO in the exposition, or the first part, once again, he puts FO in the same spot with the same encouragement and the same marking of that importance. And there you see it in the first violin part. And let's skip ahead to the end of the movement, and what you will see is this very marvelous running down of the whole group, and you see it marked by the two P's with the two lines emphatically used, so we're getting softer and softer and fading away. And then finally we turn the corner and end with a nice set of forte chords. So I think you see that Beethoven started the work. He showed us that first arrival has that special importance. He showed us in the same spots in both the exposition and the recapitulation that was a moment for an extra volt of energy in the kind of boisterous playing. And of course, he had these marvelous uses of the special energy in the soft playing for preparing the recapitulation, for that special contrast of the bend marcato and the smooth version. And then you saw that great energy put into the staccatos as the group carries out a kind of a conversation during that interesting sort of mixed section that we looked at. Well, now we enter the second movement, and this is the score which is in the Library of Congress. These actual pages are there, and replicas of them are easily available online, and I encourage you to look at them. And this is, and once again, sort of screaming off the page, is two P's with two lines, which again just calls on us to create this softness and excitement and kind of bubbling, fleeting energy. You look at the end of the page and you see that these expressive swells used over and over again in their diamond form. And then we have a crescendo and we go to da-da-da-da-da, and we end it. It's a very short movement. This movement is only 2 minutes long. Then we have a middle section. Now you notice that that's that same kind of checkerboard construction that we were mentioning. You will see it just come back again and again in the piece. But here's one other form of it. Well, first violin is playing in the lower register there, and we're building up. It's exciting. Now, I love this page because it doesn't actually have a dynamic, but Beethoven taking out his giant pen does seem to create a very clear energy in those 7 notes. And I love the way he even includes the single note on the start of the second line with that great big pen. And notice how careful he is to even put in the note names because he's afraid he might have made it a little bit unclear. Now you see when it goes on from that burst of energy, which again doesn't have a dynamic, but I think we understand what it's aiming at. Then the first violin has that special energy in the way it proceeds with the piano. Again, these are very, very welcome for me to try to cause that in my part as I play it. Well, we do our repeat. We're asked to go to pianissimo, and the energy's in all the parts, and again, very welcome. Now we do a crescendo, and finally the same material we started with is done in the upper register. And I think you can see loud and clear that where the first violin does that, Beethoven has progressed from F to FO. Once again, very, very welcome clarification of the escalation of the intensity. And indeed, you remember those crazy 7 notes. Well, they are repeated. There they appear. He's gotten more civilized and put an indication to just play them 1 octave higher. But you see that that energy of the special pen has now become the dynamic FFMO. And that is exactly, almost a perfect way to express what the energy of FFMO is. Well, we make a transition back, and we go back to the 2-line pianissimo. And now he decides to stay there. And in fact, he marks PPMO in the 2 violin parts, just where they're doing these crazy trills. So he's really reminding us, stay super soft, stay super excited. And he keeps it soft. And this is a subtle point, but on this page, you can actually see where he had to redraw the lines. And if you look closely enough, that's the point in the music where he had prior used the diamonds. And it seems that he put them there, thinking he might go back to that idea. But instead, he changed his mind. He crossed out those diamonds, and he kept it in the super pianissimo. So it stays there, and then we go up, and now we do have the diamonds again. And then, you know, Beethoven loved puns. So now the last crescendo is happening, just as it did in the first part, but we have one more clarification of escalation, because what had been forte, di-di-da-da-bum, now is FO. Dun 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 dun. Then we do a little coda, and Beethoven is loving the fact that he's going to give us the special dynamic again, the 2 Ps with 2 lines, but in a, classic, slightly silly pun form. He's now combined the 2 Ps with the 2 lines with the word pizzicato, so that they share the same P. And this is a joke that he's actually made in a number of manuscripts, and I do kind of find it to be, it is quite amusing. And then we get softer and softer, and then we finally we just close it off with a loud kind of exclamation. Once again, this is a manuscript. It's 2 minutes of music, great music, and easy to view on the library's website. I would encourage you to look at it closely. It's just wonderful. You'll also see lots and lots of decisions he made about little details about how the music was going to unfold, little changes he made. Now you're seeing the first page of the 3rd movement. This piece happened to get divided all across the globe, actually. The first movement is in Krakow. The second movement, as we've talked about at length, is at the Library of Congress in Washington. And the 3rd movement is in Paris. And the 4th movement is in Brno, in the Moravian Museum. The 5th movement is in Berlin. And the Grosse Fugue is once again in Krakow. Well, looking at this first page, you immediately see the energy that goes into all the different staccati that Beethoven marks. But you should know that in this movement, the theme has gone back to this acceleration idea. So all the instruments are going to be passing around this theme that goes long note, deem, da-da. So dum, pim, pa-pa. And that, again, is that acceleration motif. It also happens that lots of the ornamentation is going to be in the form of an empty beat, then answered by two notes. So it's going to be, again, like this sort of checkerboard idea. Empty, da da, da da, and pa-da-da-pa, pa-da-da-pa. Very playful and wonderful texture. And this movement is just so ornate. I do kind of think of it almost like a beautiful Christmas tree with its just hundreds of different ornaments. Well, now we talked about a little pairing, like those bars that started the whole piece. But there are also very large pairings that make up this work. One of the ways we can look at this is in its form of 6 movements. So the first pair is with this large first movement and really tiny second movement. Then the second pair is the third and the fourth movement. And interestingly, those are in D flat major and G major, which are a tritone apart, so about as non-intersecting as you can get in terms of pitches. And also, the third movement is in every combination of the rhythmic groups of 4, and the fourth movement is basically building on fundamental combinations of 3. It also has a danza alla tedesca, which is this dancing element where that 3 rhythm is just an enormous part of the flavor of the dance. Well, let's see that fourth movement, and I'm actually going to show this to you on an addition that is actually what the quartet is using when we're rehearsing these days. Because with all of these thousands of marks that are a little different than printed editions that we work with, what I decided to do was take an old Breitkopf and Hertel edition of the Opus 130 and the Grosse Fugue and basically use a red pen to cross out marks and replace marks so that someone studying the piece could really read the manuscript in a very legible form. So maybe we can look at this edition that the quartet is using right now. This I've sort of evolved since making this edition of Opus 130 and the Grosse Fugue to a form where I actually write out the entire edition in a music notation software starting from scratch so that it can be even more of a truly printed version of what is seen in the manuscript. And again, my suggestion to people is combine that with a scholarly edition so that you're getting all the different influences, but you're able to read this very wonderful information which is in Beethoven's handwriting. Well, the fourth movement may be in 3, but I think you can imagine it's a very charming melody which could be continuous, but in fact when you look at it on the page you realize Beethoven has put all kinds of marks which actually break it up into those checkerboards. And it still holds together as a melody, but it has all of these shifting energies which give it a very playful and effervescent kind of quality of transformation all the time. And well, one detail that you might not really notice as you're listening is that underneath that lulling melody that you hear in the violins, actually the lower instruments are alternating in groups of 2. So low, high, low, high, low, high, low, high. Well, that's going to get expanded in the movement so that by the end of the movement, that's going to be alternating where they're actually groups of instruments are playing on each of those, alternating, and that's contradicting the 3 rhythm with a kind of a checkerboard rhythm written across it. That's starting to sound a little too complicated when I explain it, but I think what it all adds up to is this rich sense of texture that we get when we're listening to this movement. So there's that pair of the third movement with its ornate groups of 4, its acceleration rhythm, then the danza alla tedesca, this charming dance, but with all these layers of of undercurrents, rhythmic undercurrents. That's the second pair. And then we have the final pair, which is the cavatina and the Grosse Fugue. And, you know, one can stand back from Beethoven's work, and I do come to the realization that something like the Missa Solemnis is a work that he had tremendous pride in what he had been able to express in music in that work. And I think he felt the same about the Grosse Fugue. Beethoven had grown up playing the well-tempered clavier as a very young child. Famous letter confirming that even by the age of 12 he could play all of the well-tempered clavier from memory. And going on to say any musician knows what this means. That was his teacher speaking. And throughout his life he worked with fugues, and he often would play the well-tempered clavier. He would often say, I'm going to give a blessing to the evening and play one of the preludes or fugues or both to conclude a gathering, a musical gathering. So these works were just deep, deep in his experience of learning and loving music. And so here we arrive at 1:30, and he's decided he is going to write the fugue of all fugues. And he writes the Grosse Fugue. Now, we're talking about pairings, so we had the first movement, the big first movement, the tiny second movement, the ornate fours of the third movement, and then the lulling and complex threes of the fourth movement. Then we enter into the cavatina, and it is a pair with the Grosse Fugue. Now, the cavatina is a work that some anecdotes speak about Beethoven even coming to tears just imagining the music of the cavatina. I can easily relate to that. It is so touching the way it is calm but just expresses something so rich and deep about our emotion. Now, if we look at the beginning of the cavatina, and I do want you to see the score here, once again we have this sort of checkerboard of ideas. We have the three instruments doing a sort of an introductory gesture of eighth notes. And you notice the diamond swells, which are so prominent in the way they're asked to be expressive. Also sotto voce, so like whispering with great kind of feeling. Once again, the first violin in that second bar is going to use that acceleration motif. So deen, dun, dun, dee, da, da. Same idea, accelerating. Once again, the checkerboard goes back, answered by the eighth notes again. Once again, the acceleration motif in the first violin. So we're doing this alternation. Then, as you look at this page, you see one more beautifully expressive swell pair. And then finally, yet another one at the end of the page, all connected in the most intentional kind of way and the most beautiful kind of way in terms of the musical effect. Happens that this movement also has a kind of a pairing where the second violin will play a certain melody, and then the same melody will be played right after it by the first violin. They add different amounts of ornaments and slightly different harmonizations, but again, it's this kind of pairing, this checkerboarding of slight contrasts or extreme contrasts sometimes. Just keep doing this alternation of identifiable units to form a kind of a beautiful grid, as it were. And then, something happens in the cavatina which really connects to the Grosse Fugue, in that it just launches into something which is in a totally different category emotionally. You are seeing the page on which this happens, and there at the beginning of the second line, you see, by the way, this marking I mentioned of portato, and you see all the beautifully formed dots underneath those slurs. You see the careful attention to the groupings of 6 and 3. And you see Viola has a regular pianissimo, but second violin and cello have the pianissimo with 2 lines on it. And you see that the viola joins them 2 bars later with the pianissimo with 2 lines. That can be something that is puzzling a little bit, to say, well, did he really mean those differences? I've come to end up trusting Beethoven a lot on those kind of details, but it also may be that some of that is accidental. But there is no question that this is so appropriately marked to have the enormously special energy. And now we have a word which even just indicates how far it's gone emotionally. And that is in the first violin. I come in on this G flat, this mysterious note, and I, of course, have the 2 Ps with 2 lines on it, naturally. Then the word is there up top. It's a little hard to read, but it's beklemmt. It's like you're not even able to breathe because the emotion is so strong, and the inner excitement is just disrupting you in such a way. So there it is, beklemmt. There the word and that marking of 2 Ps with 2 lines are being connected and asking us to do something which we welcome so much being asked to do, to create this special energy. Now, you'll notice that I have those lines, those staccato marks that are not dots. And the first one is on that C flat note, but look closely at what happens on the next one. And then a complete bar later, you will see a similar mark in the last bar on this page. What you see is that the staccato mark is in the middle of the long note, and it's very, very precisely marked. And this is sort of notated in some of our editions, noting how rare such a marking is. I will tell you that this is not something that just comes from late music. In fact, you can go back to 1802 to the 8th violin sonata in the 2nd movement, and at a similar emotionally kind of pathetic expression in the music, Beethoven uses exactly the same marking, and he uses it over and over again and very, very precisely. And I think what it's telling me is to cause an energy to happen in the middle of the note, that staccato represents a kind of an emphasis and an energy. So ta ta. So I'm going to bend that note or shake that note. And that works very well. It's extremely beautiful to try to do that. And it points us in another direction, which makes us think about some of the mysteries of Beethoven's notation. And this is a very well-known mystery that is most prominent in the Grosse Fugue, but in fact appears all throughout Beethoven's music, which is where he takes 2 of the same pitches and writes them as separate notes and slurs them together. So no change of pitch, but a second note written that in a sense doesn't need to be there. You could just notate it as a note twice as long. Well, let's get back to that, but what you will see here is that the first violin, the other instruments are in 3s, and the first violin is kind of almost in a haze, kind of doing all these rhythms that are in 4s against those 3s. And this just has a marvelous effect, and it's a kind of a dream state almost, and a kind of a distress, but incredibly beautiful music. And then, well, you see I do it as syncopated 16th notes. They're in the 2nd bar on that page. And then I do what basically is the same rhythm on the next line, and yet he's written it as double notes with slurs on them. From one point of view, they are the same, what happens in the earlier bar and the later bar, but clearly they're not the same. Clearly he's asking for something different. That is going to be perhaps the most prominent marking in the Grosse Fugue, and groups argue endlessly about how they should do it. But I will say this much, that clearly he wants something to happen on that second note. So we need to do something on that second note, and we need to search for what that is. And maybe it's not even exactly the same all the time. Well, in this case, da, da, I shake the note. That's what I do in this case. And I think on this same page, you will see one of those prominent and extremely important examples where Beethoven did not connect the expressive swells. In fact, here, with that marvelous F flat that's in the bass, we have a clear separation of the swells in order to feature that harmony as its own event. Now, move forward a tiny bit. Once again, the melodies return. We have the swells. And then the closing ideas involve you see that here the first violin reaches up for this note, and finally it passes over to the cello. And when the cello reaches up to that same note, it's as if Beethoven wants to say, I want to make sure you hear this. So you will see he carefully gives it a separate swell, not a linked swell. Now, there's so much to say about the Grosse Fugue, and it's an impossibility to really venture into it too deeply. But I will share how, in fact, its large structure is the same kind of checkerboard that we've been dealing with through the whole work. So the cavatina and the Grosse Fugue form one of those pairs. But then once we are inside the 16 minutes of the Grosse Fugue, we also have a most dramatic kind of checkerboard. We have an introduction that kind of spins through a lot of different material. The very first idea in the Grosse Fugue, which you see here, is about the most energetic acceleration motif I've ever seen. We start with a tremendously long note and then move up to fast notes from there. Then we enter into 4 minutes of fortissimo. And in that 4 minutes of fortissimo, the theme is almost always on the offbeat with empty main beats. And that is yet another form of this checkerboard. And that note that is on the offbeat is almost always written as 2 notes slurred together into one, even though they're the same pitch. And indeed, as we play it, we try to play that second note within the slur, ba, ba, and give it that energy that he seems to be asking for. Now, many, many details inside that 4 minutes of fortissimo. Rhythms are operating at groups of 2, 3, and 4, with rests in between in such a way that it's as if things are passing through each other because of small gaps. And the notion, and I think the reality, is that you can hear everything at the same time because there's a gap being made in the rhythm for you to hear the other part. It's a kind of a splicing together. Just marvelous. And the checkerboard then goes the totally opposite direction. The second 4-minute section is all pianissimo. And there are many varieties of the 2-line pianissimo and PPMO that give us little voicing hints about how that evolves. Eventually, that long section of pianissimo will rise up to an FOR where the whole group is singing together in unison. Then we launch into the next 4 minutes of fortissimo. So remember, 4 minutes of fortissimo, 4 minutes of pianissimo, 4 minutes of fortissimo. In this fugue, we call it a gear fugue because it uses the acceleration motif, long, shorter, 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 yum, chum, chum. But then it goes even further. While that's going on, you have another part doing ba-dee-dum, so kind of one level faster, and then another one going ba-da-dum, and then another one going ba-da-dum. And as you can imagine, with Beethoven being Beethoven, he makes sure that they are all going at the same time in the most incredible way. This goes forward into a section which is just like all the pianissimo music, but now it's forte and just absolutely glorious. There is one more pair that I find just so much fun. After that FOR that ended the 4 minutes of soft playing, and FOR meaning forte, but with the special emphasis, he does something we call the nanny nanny boo boo, and it's very playful music. almost silly. And then from that erupts the second section of Fortissimo. And then after that sort of glorious, loud version of the music that had been soft, he does the nanny nanny boo boo music one more time. And so that becomes a kind of a pair as well. And the second time, it sets up what we kind of call the celebration section, and that's the last 4 minutes of the Grosse Fugue. And in that, we have all the themes kind of coming back in all their forms, and a kind of a joyous, celebratory feel to everything that's going on. He takes us back through his old ideas, and then comes to this just absolutely thrilling closure of the whole fugue. It does happen that the manuscript, by the way, is missing the last couple of pages. So we can't see those last few bars of the piece. But I will say it's kind of nice that the very last marking that I see is where I start the last crescendo. And it is 2 Ps with 2 lines. And from there we just rise and the viola kind of carries us through and we just charge through the end of the piece. I hope that you enjoy this performance. It is an unending joy to play this piece, to continue to investigate it. And I encourage you, look at these sources for these pieces. Even if you had a different view of the details I've been showing, just to sense the energy that is so much just erupting from the pages gives you a thrilling sense of that energy that really fed this music from this great, great and generous man, Beethoven. We hope that you enjoy it. We hope that you continue to love looking into, investigating, going deeper into this marvelous music. And thank you for listening.